right now, you should go to patreon.com/unregistered and become a patron of this show. When you do that, you will have access to roughly half of the episodes of Unregistered. You can also see the weekly unreported news analysis show with me, regular AMAs, and you'll have access to Thursday night's Unregistered Live Zoom meetings with me. But at the Unregistered Academy level, you can take all of our courses. We already have 5 on the books that you can watch right now, and we have multiple live interactive webinars coming up throughout the summer. So again, go to patreon.com/unregistered and become a patron right now. I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Should we continue to defund the police, refund the police, or do something else entirely? This is my interview with Wilfred Reilly. I am joined from Frankfort, Kentucky, by the great political scientist, social scientist, Wilfred Reilly, who is the king of Twitter in my estimation. Will, I learn something new pretty much every day from your Twitter, and you do what I think public intellectuals should do, is to ask questions about received wisdom, what is considered to be common sense, and you poke holes in those. You ask questions about the received wisdom, and then you supply a lot of evidence, hard evidence, we call it, or quantitative evidence, that even though I'm not a quant guy, always makes me rethink the issues. And these are issues that I do professionally and have done for decades. So I just want to say that first off, that your Twitter's killing it. And you're making a lot of people rethink things. But you also have this brand new article out that you co-authored on policing that is pretty awesome and made me rethink again this issue that I've been chewing on for many, many years. And it's one of the most important issues for me, as people know. But you and a group of other social scientists put together what you call the Police Performance Index, and you rank all the cities in the country, which I love. I love lists and rankings, as to how well, and we'll talk about what well means, but how well the police in those cities police. And it has very interesting outcomes. We see who are the top cities, which are the lower cities, but it's a very interesting way, I think, most importantly, to think about policing and criminal justice and the effects of Black Lives Matter and all that stuff. It's a very, very important way to go about that, I believe. So let's do this. Let's start there, and then we can broaden the discussion about other stuff. So tell us about this article and tell us about the Police Performance Index.
Yeah, so I mean, the article itself was something I wrote pretty recently with a group of other people. I mean, I actually wasn't the lead author on the article. I mean, it was me, Bob Moranto. Everyone else was in Arkansas. So it was myself, Bob Moranto of the University of Arkansas, Pat Wolf from Arkansas, Maddie Harris, who's one of their better graduate students. But yeah, we wrote this piece. What we wanted to do is, the working title is Making Black Lives Matter, Which Police Departments Do Their Job. And I think it's an interesting question. Like, what we did first is look at the existing sort of literature on Black Lives Matter and look at one, did the movement really, this isn't our focus, but did the movement reduce crime, or did it reduce even police homicides? Police in America do shoot a lot of people. So, and that's a problem. I mean, I think both you and I lean libertarian on some issues. So why are there 1,000 police shootings every year? A lot of that gets into war on drugs, so on. But did BLM really cut back on that? And I actually expected to find that it did to some extent, but that's point one. Did it reduce police shootings? Did it reduce crime? And two, within that literature on this, I mean, do you see any kind of in-depth analysis on how that happened when activist movements on the left, or for that matter on the right, have the most significant effect on policing? And the third component, I guess, the second, the B portion of the paper is which police departments are doing the best job right now. And the metric, the police performance index, is actually very simple. It's based on the idea that there are two components of how well a police department does its job. One, what's the crime rate in the city? And I mean, we were using homicide, a few serious violent crimes as a proxy. But two, what's the rate of negative interactions with the population? So I mean, you can literally divide homicide rate by number of people shot by the police over a decade or whatever time frame, and then say log that for the quants out there, and you can see how well the police are doing. So we do calculate that for a block of cities, actually all the large cities in the country. And so I mean, a couple interesting things come out of this. I mean, first, I don't, and again, this wasn't the focus of the paper, but it's something I look at for this, and we've looked at before. Black Lives Matter doesn't seem to have had that much of an effect. I mean, if you go back to 2012, 2015, I mean, the earlier years in that Washington Post database, the police were shooting about 1,000 people a year. If you look at last year, the police shot, I believe, 993 people. I mean, there's been no difference, no change. I mean, unarmed people is usually just a bit under 100. Unarmed Black people, I think, was 30 in the first year of the sample, 20 last year. And that change of 10 or 12, I don't think is probably stochastic. That's just almost random luck. So we didn't see too many massive changes, really.
Well, wait a minute. You're burying the bombshell, aren't you? There's been a massive change, according to you. You said that you estimate that BLM initiated policy changes were followed directly by the deaths of 2,874 more Black citizens, almost 3,000 more Black people nationwide in a single year than would normally be expected.
Well, so yeah, I was being.
The result is that there's more Black people dead because of BLM. That's what you're saying, Will Reilly?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually wasn't going to shy away from that at all. I mean, but I was kind of giving the opponent their argument for a second. Okay. Like, are there fewer police killings, either no or by a little bit? And you do need to address that first. Right. The papers that have looked at this have found basically what you said, that movements against police violence in individual cities have had maybe a very slight reductive effect on police homicides. They're down maybe 10%. And again, a homicide is any human being who's violently killed. I mean, you don't want to use terms like deserved it, but that would include anyone who's struggling with the police. Those aren't all unarmed individuals. But the flip side of that is that the police engaged in less proactive policing. There were just fewer stops in those cities. So the number of Black people, and by the way, young working class white and Hispanic people, so on, that were killed in those same locations was thousands higher. I think it was Fryer that found this, 2,000 to 6,000 more just citizens were killed in the cities where you saw this tiny reduction in police homicides. And what we're discussing almost exactly tracks with that. Yeah, I think the figure in this paper is about 3,000. So yeah, if you pull back the police and you instruct them not to draw their guns unless it's necessary, you might see a few less deaths. But it turns out the police weren't randomly drawing their guns in the first place in the large majority of departments. So as they police less, and as that works in accordance with the behavior of prosecutors like Boudin, for example, you get more crime, and so you get more deaths. I mean, we saw 20,000 homicides as a figure last year, in 2020, actually, not last year, but for the first time since 1994. And I mean, I was a high school kid in that era. And I mean, that was the time frame of, that one movie, Kids, on sort of the white scene kid side. That was New Jack City. I mean, some of the urban black classics. I mean, for pretty much everyone who lived in a city, almost color aside, that was a pretty chaotic era. I mean, people were having sex and using drugs openly on trains. And, you know, as enjoyable as that might have been, if you were in an urban high school, it's not really the sort of, it doesn't bring tourists into the city, let's say. So we're now returning to the crime numbers that you used to see in that era. And that's pretty problematic. So we did find that. We did find only a slight, you know, no or a slight reduction in police homicides. We did find increased deaths, and that's consistent with what everyone's found. But in terms of the focuses of our paper, what we found in the Black Lives Matter literature was that there wasn't a lot of sort of aggressive attempt to find out how to make policing more effective. And this is, to me, like, without going on one of my like rambles, this is an issue in social science. Like, a lot of things are off limits. You're not supposed to talk about IQ. You're not supposed to talk about problems in minority communities. You're not supposed to talk about migration. You're not supposed to talk about a lot of the stuff on the right too. I mean, how close is America to being a police state? What can we do about guns? So very often you get people working on these tertiary side issues, like how much racism can we find in, you know, whatever space this is. And you got a lot of that with BLM. People really didn't want to look at, did these guys cause more Black deaths? Which is kind of the obvious question with BLM, right? I mean, did they make the police kill less people? Right. Maybe, probably not. And did they get more Black people killed? Yeah. I mean, so those are the two big ones. The hosses in the room. Yeah. And I mean, I saw you just did the See No Evil, you know,
incredible.
Thing. I mean, yeah. You know, but the Chinese monkey approach, this is used to refer to the bronze statues, not to anything racist. I mean, for the observers. But I mean, like, that's pretty common. So what you had was a lot of writing about like how Black Lives Matter mobilized potential voters, this kind of thing. Right. So we look at that, and then we tried to look at what makes police departments effective. And so we did this index. It's like a lot of good quantitative work. I mean, you don't actually need to do like an endless series of, you know, Poisson regressions or something like that. It's just we looked at the crime rate over the police homicide rate, and we were able to rank cities. Bob and Pat did more of that than I did, but I'm a very competent methodologist myself. Maddie looked at it. It is what it is. It's a good system. And the thing that was striking about it is that the cities that did well weren't the cities you'd expect. Like New York City apparently had, in fact, definitely, we all vetted this, has one of the best police departments in the country. Right. And New York City always takes a lot of crap. I mean, Saturday Night Live back long ago, and it was occasionally funny, did a whole like New York City welcome to Sodom series of tourism ads. This was like 1992. People are getting robbed as soon as they get off trains and so on. That's the city's had that reputation for a while. But New York City also has something like 10 million residents. I mean, Chicago, where we've both spent a great deal of time, is a world city, and it's half that. You know, London is 8 million within the actual metropolitan borders. So given that qualifier, I mean, New York City, 400, 500 homicides a year is doing a good job. They also don't have that many police shootings. And you contrast that with much smaller cities like Baltimore that have not far from 1,000 murders every year and a good number of police shootings. And you can see which departments are good, which are competent, and which are not. So, I mean, Baltimore brought up the rear of our list, Kansas City, Tulsa. It was very often sort of mid-sized cities that have a problem with municipal corruption. Most, but by no means all, run by Democrats. I mean, there was sort of a model to them.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. But so you found that the policies enacted in response to Black Lives Matter demands, let's just say this again, according to your estimates, and apparently many others, resulted in close to 3,000 more Black deaths than would have occurred otherwise. That BLM, I don't know how you would want to phrase this, but BLM's policies, the culmination is 3,000 more dead people, Black, who are Black.
Yeah, well, the way I say it in my book, Taboo, bluntly, is BLM got a lot of brothers killed. I mean, I think that when you look at a policy, there are two things that you can approach, you can deal with. One is its moral intentions, and the other is its practical applications and its effects. This is one of those great Thomas Sowell lines that always stuck with me. And normally when we talk about things like affirmative action, the idea is, or the discussion becomes focused almost entirely around what were the goals behind the policy? Or do we have a moral duty to implement this policy? You know, we had a state of near race war in this country for 100+ years, blacks getting the worst of it, Jim Crow, sharecropping. What do we owe this group of dedicated Americans? And no one ever asked, to some extent, would this be a good thing for black people or for our white countrymen? Is this going to promote the study skills that will actually boost the black community up to full competitiveness? And Sol wrote an entire book about this affirmative action globally, and he found very similar patterns of behavior in every major country, Malaysia, for example, where you have these programs in place. And he finds that they're generally between a slight negative and a big negative. It's the same thing here. I mean, the conversation around Black Lives Matter has generally centered on, do we have a duty to do something about policing? Do we have a duty to listen to black people when it comes to policing, given some of the history of policing, especially in the South? You know, the history of policing in the USA has involved chasing down slaves and this kind of thing. And that's an interesting conversation, but a much more practical, real question is, what's going to happen in working poor neighborhoods, which aren't just black, by the way. Right. The test of every policy can't just be, is this good for black people? But what's going to happen in those neighborhoods if you pull back the cops? And I mean, to me, Bob and I might look at this in another paper, but to me, the key variable here is just police stops. So it's possible to really screw around with numbers. I mean, people, for example, mostly on the political left, have found that you can look at police department budgets, and there's not much of a correlation between police budget and crime rate. But that's true for almost anything. There's not much of a correlation between school district funding and performance either, because it's not a metric for competence. Like whether the police have old army vehicles to tool around and, you know, feel manly using doesn't have much to do with whether they're getting rapists off the street. So what we find is that when you have just a lot of officers who are good enough that they aren't getting civilian complaints and they're all making the standard number of stops per day, you do see crime decline. And one of the effects of movements like Black Lives Matter is that you see less proactive policing. Community leaders will very often ask cops not to be proactive, not to do pat down stops, not to do stop and frisks, and instead to do what's called community policing, to do a lot of walking around, to do a lot of police athletic league kind of stuff. So you see stops fall by maybe 50 to 70%, and you see crime surge accordingly. Anyway, under BLM, my opinion, and our data supports this, is that you saw that, and you saw an increase in crime. And this is my actual opinion, would be that pretty much every time you've tried this set of policies, you've seen a similar surge in crime. I mean, between this is almost a pat, I've said it in so many interviews, but I'll try to do the best version of it here. But I mean, between like 1963 and 1993, you saw about a 500% increase in crime. I mean, like murders in 1963 numbered about 8,000. And in 1993, at about the end of that one movie Kids era that we were both describing and spent some time in, I mean, you had, I think it was 24,500 murders nationally. And there were also a lot of unexplained disappearances that year. So, I mean, what happened? A bunch of people, Mona Charen, the conservative think tank scholar, wrote a whole book about this called Do-Gooders, where she breaks down all the criminal justice reforms in that 30-year period, mostly at the start. But like you had Miranda, which I think we'd mostly support, like the police have to read you your rights. But you had Escobedo, which really enhanced the Miranda protections in a case involving a scumbag rapist, frankly. You had the exclusionary rule, fruit of the poison tree. So if the cops make any mistake during, for example, a search, everything they find is tossed out. You had community policing, maximum sentences, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, a lot of the things that occurred to counter that, like the real backlash against drugs in 94, were also in their way bad. But you saw during that period massive softening on crime, and you saw a massive surge in crime. And that's just economics. Like you're analyzing the likelihood of getting punished for this fun but risky activity to some extent. Selling drugs, brawling, should you do it? Well, what's the risk I'll get caught? And similarly, Black Lives Matter has just been a shorter-lived return to this to some extent. I mean, for 2014, the Ferguson effect, 2017, the riots, and now this again, we've seen these little jumps where we again try just kind of not having law, and it doesn't work.
Okay, so defunding police, reducing the number of police, results in simply more crime, more murder, more robbery, all of it, more rape. That's the hypothesis or the thesis here?
Well, I think that that's to some extent the conclusion. They're they're actually two different things, I would say. One, I've actually argued against defunding the police before. I wrote a piece in Quillette focusing on this. I've been asked to turn that into an academic piece, but I don't know if defunding is really the term. So again, I mean, you could argue, and I've talked, I mean, he didn't have this debate with me, but Sam Singway is an anti-policing activist. And, you know, like him right now, he's pretty good with numbers. I mean, he will argue pretty persuasively that police budgets don't really have that much to do with the crime rate. And I think that's probably true. Similarly, you find like in the research I've done, there's a virtually 100% correlation between the difference between the black and the white crime rates nationally and the difference at which blacks and whites are shot by police, if that makes sense. So the black crime rate's about 2.4 times the white crime rate. And this isn't due to like magical genetic properties or something. Like the average black dude's a decade younger than the average white guy, like many times more likely to live in a city, like so on down the line. But I mean, but at any rate, the difference is there. You can't ignore it in the black community, certainly. But so that reality is there. Like if you just adjust for the difference in crime rate, the difference in police shooting, like blacks make up 12% of the population, but 25% of police shooting victims vanishes. In fact, it's exactly what you'd expect. Blacks make up 2.1 to 2.4 times as many of the police shooting victims as you would think, based on the 12%. But that's exactly the crime rate differential. But what you find at a more local, precise level is that there's not really much of a relationship between crime rate or crime rate by race in a specific city and how many people the cops shoot. Like, again, the police shoot more people in Kansas City than they do in New York City, which just objectively makes no sense unless you're coming from a place of maybe they need more training in KC in the second case. Some of the Oklahoma cities would be another good example. So similarly, like defunding, I mean, police budgets are pretty large. Like from my perspective as a taxpayer, I think you could take a lot of money away from the schools, the cops, and so on, and have those services run pretty well. I mean, like I think it's Maryland recently, and I could easily be wrong about the state, but one of the states recently reached a threshold they'd been shooting for, just $30,000 per pupil in non-high school classrooms. So they're going like every kid should have a laptop and so on. And like I went to school when the goal was getting every kid a book. Like I went to the Chicago and Aurora public schools, and I'm like, we did fine. The schools weren't great, but they were mostly functional. So like, could you cut that in half, you know, and make charter opportunities more widely available and landscape the grounds and do some other things probably. But I do think that what you see with policing is that there's, I'm actually going to call this a Bowden effect after Chesa, however you say it, Chesa Bodine.
Yeah.
Out in
San Francisco DA.
Yes. Thank you. San Francisco DA, Chesa Boudin. But I think that when you see the police simply engage in fewer police stops, and that's followed by prosecutors that refuse to enforce the law, you see a surge in crime. That would be my hypothesis, yes, but it's also the conclusion of the paper and of Fryer 2019 and so on down the line. I mean, there's a graphic that's going around on Twitter and Facebook today that's headlined something like the Boudin effect, and people can look at it, but it's just the number of cases brought by the DA's office under each DA. So it's like 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, it's stable, it's 10,000 or whatever it is. Then it's Boudin, it's like 21, 22. And it's cut by 2/3. And I mean, you could argue crime hasn't yet surged that much, but I mean, there's a learning period. Obviously, as this goes on and as more people from the past get out of jail, you're going to see crime increase, and you're going to see the same people, mostly on that political left, act as though this is a great mystery.
Right. So, okay. Everyone in the country, when Michael Brown was killed, said, almost everyone, in fact, a lot of conservatives were saying this too at that time, oh my God, the police are killing too many people, black or white or whatever. The BLM response was defund the police, reduce police interactions, reduce the number of police. You have found that resulted in catastrophe. You are saying instead of worrying about funding or defunding or the money that's put into police departments, the answer is in techniques and policies, correct? And that's the point. And that's the point of the index. You came up with an index to find out which departments have the best policing techniques. Is that correct?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
that's correct. I mean, one of the thing that really stood out, and I'd say it was probably Pat that looked at these the most in depth, but obviously, again, everybody did. The technique that most stood out in terms of lowering police, and this sounds almost stupid, but the technique that stood out the most in terms of lowering negative police citizen interactions was just getting rogue cops off the street.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big problems in policing, and you know this, and anyone who's ever talked to a cop in depth on a show like this, much less at a bar, knows this, is that there is that thin blue line culture where you're not going to turn on a fellow officer. You know, you're out there in the streets together, so on down the line. But what you find, this is the case with male crime in general, interestingly. But what you find is that a tiny minority of the cops, it's like 1.2%, rack up the actual majority of the citations and complaints.
Right.
I mean, like Derek Chauvin, when you talk about the George Floyd case, I mean, there's a lot that people don't discuss, honestly. Like Floyd was trying to get his life together, but had been a career criminal. Like he was on a combination of meth and fentanyl, which obviously contributed to his dying during that interaction. I mean, I watched most of the trial as a black guy, as someone on the right, also just as a citizen. And I mean, like at one point they mentioned that the police officer Chauvin's knee wasn't actually on George Floyd's neck. It was sort of on his back. And it probably would not have been able to kill him. And that was just sort of slid by. It was something discussed and moved on from. So the George Floyd case isn't what a lot of people think it was. But you also, I mean, it's not exactly, I think you could say, you know, an example of sterling policing, where there's a crowd gathering and, you know, the cop is arguing with them and there's other cops sort of standing around, not much is happening. I mean, so it's relevant to this then that Chauvin had something like 3 previous serious complaints. Okay. Like he once shot a guy and killed him. So, and a lot of people don't know that. He had a history of moonlighting, doing other dangerous jobs while he was a cop. He'd known George Floyd while they worked at sort of a Hispanic titty bar together as bouncers. I mean, so this is stuff in his background, you know, and I don't feel like the race of the titty bar is not really all that relevant, but I mean, just like this is the kind of stuff that police department. Well, let me think about that description. Nightclub, but I mean, it's like, I don't know if they had exotic dancers most of the time. Nightclub known for some wild partying. Right. But I mean, what we find is that those departments that really do the best job of preventing that kind of encounter take rogue officers off the street really quickly. Okay. I mean, New York City, if you get 1 or 2 verified serious complaints, and I mean, there's an internal affairs bureau in any police department that can look at something and for all their flaws, tell how likely this is to be real. I mean, you're essentially taken off street duty either for a couple of years, maybe the second time, or permanently. And there are a bunch of assignments in the police department that the union's not going to complain about, but that officers are going to hate, and where you're not going to interact with the public. Motor pool, you know. So that's something that solidly performing police departments do. You take your probable rogues and you bust them down. You remove rank from them, or you just take them. They can have rank, but they're taken out of public-facing positions. That's probably the big thing. Whenever I look at one of these BLM cases, there are 2 things I look at, and I'm always amazed by both. But one, what's the criminal record of the guy involved? And was he resisting arrest? Because frankly, that is relevant. I mean, the presentation is always the person in their graduation gown, you know, another star of the Black community gunned down. And almost inevitably, it's a career criminal. But the flip side is, what kind of cop was this? What's their jacket look like? Often it's a good cop. More than half the time, it's not. And I mean, I think you could eliminate half those cases by just getting those cops, who again come from that marginal 1% of officers, off the street. So that's something. There were some really innovative techniques that some departments used. I mean, one of them, this may have been New York City as well, actually, but one of the departments first trained their officers to fight. They encouraged them to roll, to spar on fairly frequent occasions. And then they made them fill out this obnoxious block of paperwork. I actually looked it up on the internet after researching this as part of the paper. But every time they pull their gun, not use it. So obviously a gunfire incident, you always have to write up. But the idea here was that you teach the officers to fight. And anytime a weapon is deployed, they're going to sit down for 6 hours and they're going to explain what they were doing and what they were thinking, and they're going to go to a therapist. And what you find is that the officers they're still not going to risk their lives, but in marginal situations, they tend to just fight, or they tend to use verbal judo. They tend to talk the guy down, spend an extra half hour on it. And again, that leads to dramatically reduced civilian casualty situations. So take the rogue cops off the street. Don't tolerate more than 1 or 2 complaints for an officer. Don't tolerate officers doing dumb shit. I mean, I described some of the stuff that was in Derek Chauvin's background, and that'll get you most of the way there. And then create a system of Freakonomics style inconveniences where officers are rewarded with $2,000 if they go to the dojo, but they're punished with a 12-hour document if they draw a firearm, and you'll see fewer people shot. And again, cops rarely shoot unarmed people, but if you want to get it down to the level of a department in New York size shoots 1 a year, I mean, that's what you would do.
Yeah. So by the way, let's say this right off the bat. So 1,000 people basically a year are shot by the police in this country, but the vast majority of those were armed people.
Yep.
Right. So the number of people who are killed who are unarmed by police in a year is around 10, right? The average is somewhere around there total.
Well, that's unarmed Black people. I mean, yeah, it's so the number of unarmed people total is under 100. I mean, so that gets into a couple of the things about this debate. We've gotten very used to thinking of the number of people killed by police in terms of the number of Blacks.
Yes.
In fact, the 75% majority of people killed by the police aren't Black.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those
no one cares.
things.
Will, no one cares. No one cares when a white person is killed by the police. No one cares. It's incredible.
Well, we'll keep saying it together, but I mean, no, it really it's a problem. Like if you look at Roland Fryer's first paper on this, 2016, I mean, he's looking at this in Dallas. So I mean, in practice, you can probably say the people that were most likely to be shot by the police were poor whites and recent Latino immigrants. I mean, kind of reading between the lines or looking at what precincts those were, and that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, those groups also, frankly, have high crime rates. But there's not the same element of Al Sharptonism kind of. Like if you're in a trailer park or you're in a barrio area, like you're going to have as much crime as you do in most hood neighborhoods, but there's not going to be the same sort of, if you shoot a guy who's climbing a fence with a bag of goods over his back, there aren't going to be neighborhood leaders coming out and castigating you and calling for an end to your career. So what Fryer found, and this is often misrepresented, frankly, it's presented as he didn't find evidence that Blacks were more likely to be shot. So you're left thinking Blacks were a little more likely to be shot, but it wasn't statistically significant. Or people focus on the early parts of the paper where he found Black people were 10% or whatever it was more likely to be lightly manhandled. What Fryer actually found was that the white and Hispanic suspects were 30% more likely to be shot with everything adjusted for than Black suspects. Like they were a third more likely to be shot and to be killed. So, I mean, we've known that for a while. There's really no other point there. Just there's no attention paid to it. So the full figure, even in years where there are 20 unarmed Black people shot, they're slightly under 100 unarmed people shot. But again, that's a tiny minority of people. Unarmed also, I think more to the point we're making, includes people that are, like if you're driving an Escalade toward a cop, you're unarmed. I mean, there are usually 10 or 12 of those cases every year. Right. So it's just very few of those people are innocent victims. It's about 12 unarmed Black people typically, or something like that.
Yeah, and even if you drill down on the unarmed shootings, you will find that most of those people were doing something very aggressive toward the cops. It was not just sort of innocent people with their hands up. Roland Fryer, let's not let that go by. So you said sort of offhandedly that no one paid attention to what he said when he found in his study of policing in Houston that controlling for all the variables, that Black people were actually less likely to be shot by police than whites and Hispanics. So people did pay attention, dude. You know exactly what happened to Roland Fryer as a result of that. What happened to Roland Fryer?
Well, I mean, Roland Fryer has been accused of, he was hit with all kind of sexual assault charges or whatever, harassment. What happened to Roland Fryer? And
by the way, he's at Harvard. He's at Harvard, right?
He teaches at Harvard. One of the things that's iffy about this is that no college is ever going to come out and say, I don't think this would happen with my employer. I like to think I have a good relationship with them. But one of the things that happens at a college, least the top couple of hundred colleges, would include all of the ones I'm going to name, including mine. But no one's ever going to step forward and say, hey, it looks like you might have voted Republican. You're out of here. Because I mean, that's going to lead into some major court cases. What a libertarian professor couldn't have that. You know, so it's in general, if you become a bit of a public annoyance, you kind of start looking over your shoulder and making very sure all your grades were in on time and this kind of thing. Because there are definitely things that someone could do to harass you, to start a competition with you, try to get you out of there. With Roland Fryer, I mean, he started publishing these papers. I mean, one of them, I actually didn't see why this was controversial. This is a big rebuttal to the genetics and IQ guys. But I mean, he essentially ran part of a school district, again, in I think Houston, and showed that just using these sort of solid traditional teaching methods could boost test scores and, logically speaking, boost IQ. And that one of the big problems for Black kids, and again, by extension, urban, white, and Hispanic kids, is that they're learning this kind of woke nonsense. And I've long thought this myself, by the way, that I mean, when people are saying the test scores are going up everywhere but the cities, and this often includes white cities like Portland, well, what are they teaching across both the Black and the white mega cities that might slow calculus scores? I mean, it's not the toughest question in the game. Can we adjust for wokeness in a model? Like, I would bet the Black IQ is within 4 to 5 points of the white IQ on Army bases. I've never looked at that. I bet it's true. I challenge anyone in the audience to go check that out. But anyway, so Fryer did what I just suggested. He found that, I guess it's controversial because it implies woke nonsense is not productive for inner city students. I just realized why it's a challenge. But I mean, he did this paper on policing. He did the follow-up paper on policing. He was one of the people to find that a lot of Blacks were shot because of BLM. And then he got accused of being, it was initially presented in the media almost as if he were a rapist, but he got accused of being a sexual harasser. It turned out to be a matter of some jokes, but I mean, like, he lost his lab. And this just went on and on. Harvard considered firing him. No, he actually started fighting back kind of low key. Like, there's a movie about it now directed by an ally of his, like what happened to the nation's best Black professor. One of the things to understand with kind of the woke mob is that it's just like standard bullying. Like, if you get in a fist fight with the guy once, you might win or lose, but the bullying stops. So whenever we saw this with the Washington Post the other day, like the cringing apologies, one of their reporters, one of the Washington Post reporters retweeted, he didn't even say, the sort of classic high school locker room joke, like, hey, all girls are either bisexual or bipolar. And everyone is like, hey, that's kind of dumb, whatever, give it a like. And one of his colleagues did a string of like 17 tweets, like, I work in an environment where this kind of retweet is tolerated. You know, I need to see an apology. This went on and on. They weren't all in the initial tweet thread, but like other colleagues were responding and asking her if she was okay. And, you know, someone else weighed in and said that he just asked the two of them, why didn't they take this to HR and not embarrass the paper? So people started attacking this guy. Then someone called him a privileged white male. It turned out he was a gay Mexican. That's Del Real, who's one of their better reporters. Just went on and on and on. But I mean, my reaction to a lot of this stuff is just don't apologize. You know, do what Fryer did, make a movie about it, make it as public as possible so people will see how absurd this is. But anyway, yeah, I don't have any doubt he was penalized for this. Another example would be Charles Nagy. Do you know Nagy?
No.
He's actually a guy who'd be interesting to talk to. I mean, he's got a new book coming out about kind of like being white on campus, which sounds a little whitey, but from what I've seen, it's pretty good, pretty witty. But Charles Nagy was a professor at Central Florida, and he asked online, it was something, I'm paraphrasing, but it was like, if either Blacks or hillbillies behave like Koreans, would we still be talking about systemic whatever? And there's, again, one of these kind of throwaway tweets. The answer, by the way, is no. But I mean, you know, the university kind of freaked out. I think he took it down, but I think the first one might have just been Blacks. Then he expanded it. It was just a conversation, you know, but like then, so, but again, it's a nothing thing. I actually commented on, made fun of it a little bit, as I recall, but the university asked him to take it down. He took it down. And again, the impression is, well, we're sane people, so absolutely nothing's going to happen here. But it turns out they launched an investigation into this and asked students to come forward with sort of any negative experience they've ever had with Nagy. And this became a tribunal that went on for 8 months, where people were reporting on like being made to feel awkward in his class and so on down the line. And finally, they came up with enough random bullshit to fire him. But it turns out there's a clause in his contract that calls for arbitration in cases like this. So he went to a non-academic arbitrator and was reinstated like the next day.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, the arbitrator just wasn't having it. It's a funny all-around story. But at any rate, that is kind of what happened to Fryer. And I mean, I think we all know the reason why, but he's back. So his name's
Good. Back to the police performance index. So I want to see if I can finally reveal my anarchistic tendencies here, because I've been sounding like a pro-cop Heather McDonald kind of guy here, and I've actually debated Heather pretty viciously, in fact. So I lived in New York City, and this you will love this. I moved. You will know exactly what this means. I moved to New York City in 1991, and I left in 2008. Okay, so I saw what? I saw the transformation of New York City policing and the city itself. When I got to New York in 1991, the first day I was there was a couple. This was about 2 PM. A couple, both stark naked in the park, fighting each other over a crack pipe. It was very scary to take the subway at night. You had to be very careful about where you sat in the subway train. You were hoping to God that there was a cop on the train. I did it a lot. Nowadays, it feels like, and it is, the safest city in America. Now let's talk about this. I guess we haven't made this clear. New York City came out as the champion in the police performance index. It's the best police force, best policing practices in the country, according to you. Well, okay. Now, so now the implication is, of course, that we should do what everyone should do what New York City does in policing. Okay. Or at least something like it, right? Use it as a model, right? Okay. Now, so I moved there in 1991, terrible city, full of crime, very scary. It's a big part of life. And people forget this. When you live in a high crime area, it is always in your life. You're always scared of it. You're always adjusting the way you live according to it. Anyway, I, in 1993, lived on Broadway and 108th Street and 109th Street between Amsterdam and Broadway was a notorious drug alley, basically, with dozens of drug dealers, and you could go there any time of day or night and buy your crack or your heroin or whatever you wanted. So one day, Giuliani, who was the mayor at that point, and he's responsible for much of this, he blocked off both ends of that street, barricaded it without any announcement to the neighbors. Just all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, you can't get out of that. You can't drive out of that block, right? And then SWAT teams came in from helicopters, descended onto the roofs, went into the buildings and just arrested everybody and sent them all to Attica. And that is what happened over Giuliani's, if you don't like him, his reign, his tenure as mayor. He just locked up almost all the criminals and maybe some non-criminals or potential criminals. He just locked everybody up. And then guess what happens? The crime rate plummets in New York City, and it becomes the safest place in America, the safest city. Now, okay, I've always said that, man, and I've been running in like anarchist circles and left-wing circles, the anti-police people. I've always been with the anti-police types, and that was pretty much me for a long time. But I always argued to them, I was like, how are you denying that that's going to reduce poverty, reduce crime if you just lock up all the criminals? Of course it's going to reduce crime. Yeah, right. But then again, okay, now, Will, though. So, you're totally right there. The quantitative analysis reveals totally that. It's indisputable that if you lock up all the criminals, you're going to get a reduction in the crime rate. Now, however, we have 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country. And I don't know how many in New York State, but a hell of a lot since Giuliani and because of Giuliani. A lot of people, by the way, doing life for dealing drugs. A lot of people in New York State doing life for dealing, or close to it, decades and decades for dealing drugs. So, do we want to do that? Is that the best answer? That kind of very aggressive policing? Now, listen, I appreciated it. After all those guys were locked up on that street, I could walk down that block now at night and feel safe. That's a big deal that the left and libertarians need to address. So just, in other words, Giuliani was, if you don't like him, he was authoritarian. If you do like him, he was aggressive, but he sure locked up a lot of people in very aggressive ways. So, do you have any qualms about that?
No, not at all. Okay. Yeah, okay. So first of all, I've discussed amorality before on the air. I don't think there's any ultimate right or wrong at all. I mean, I think there are things that as an adult male warrior and merchant I wouldn't do, but I don't think there's a non-watchmaker God watching over us. I mean, that's just fantasy. I mean, so no, I mean, the goal of life is, what did Aristotle call it? Eudaimonia, honorable happiness, you know, and the thing to do is the thing that gives you the greatest long-term and short-term quantum of honorable happiness. This is what I think of as the true enlightenment. I actually realized what this once meditating after sparring, which sounds very Spartan, but is in fact true. And it's, I've never seen anything that's more true. And once you recognize it, you can just put away a lot of other stuff. Most Western postmodern philosophy is just garbage. It's prey talking to themselves. So at any rate, I mean, the thing that gives you the most happiness is usually the good, which is in fact its own reward. It makes you friends. It feels good, but not always. I mean, I ask a question whenever I teach ethics, which I find funny, but I mean, would you kill another adult fighting man for $50 million? And everyone's like, yeah. And it's like, okay, cool. That's where we're going to start the class. And so it's kind of my take on this. Like, would I lock up a bunch of criminals and vagrants to make the city safe for 2.3 million tax-paying citizens? Yeah, of course, fuck them. I mean, so that's the answer. Like, as a somewhat amoral, quite honorable leader, yeah, I would utterly break them. Anyone who resisted me would be killed. I mean, it's like, that's the answer to the question. Like, if people, I would declare, it's like the old French kings, the declaration to the mob. You have to be honorable about this sort of thing. You have to ride out on your white horse and tell your people what you're about to do. But yeah, I mean, I would absolutely tell people, like, we're going to start enforcing the law in this city. I would tell them 3 times. And then I would say, if you continue to break the law, we'll have you jailed or killed. And if people continue to break the law, I would have them jailed or killed. I mean, this sounds kind of crazy, like some guy talking this like king shit, but that is what stability is. Like, just as junkies have some basic rights, business women have a right to walk down the street without getting raped. So I think that most functional leaders, the average businessman or master sergeant in the army, would make this decision in 20 seconds flat if you gave him these options. So yes, absolutely. I would send in the state troopers who are not the stormtroopers, and I would lock up every single person who lived along an alley that was known for openly selling dope in the middle of the day. Now, the one difference here, I guess, for me is that drugs wouldn't be, if I were king, drugs wouldn't be illegal in the first place.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So I mean, so that's just bullshit. That's it, But like, if I were the governor or whatever, and I had to enforce the idiotic Rockefeller drug laws, then like, if you're standing outside openly selling crack, I'm going to arrest you. It's annoying. It's an imposition on the citizens. And this sort of thing, like, someone has to, and this is something that I feel about the Black leadership as well. Like, how can you resist our demands? How can you not agree that morally you owe us? I mean, the response is, well, we won the last war. I mean, we is flexible here. I'm half Black, you know, but it's like, well, you guys are equally brutal. We won. I mean, could have killed you all, but now we're all citizens. We gave everybody equal rights. Go fucking compete. We took all of the property from everyone in this country who was Japanese. Black soldiers largely did it in parts of Southern California. Ooh, wow. Awful thing. We gave a little recompense for it, but not much. You know, and I don't support that kind of thing. I would literally fight with a weapon to prevent any attempt to take civil rights from Black people today. But the idea that we should parse out every single dollar that's owed to every group that has suffered in the past history of this country, that's just not how human beings work, I suppose. Okay. I think that even if you wanted to respond to that in moral terms, I mean, the moral response would be, okay, well, then next we're going to tax you to pay for almost equivalent damages to natives, Irishmen, women. You know, it's this sort of thing. Actually, I kind of regret the moral deviation there because it's just a waste of time. The practical answer, as any kind of competent leader, would have to be no. Like, the negative externalities of allowing people to sit outside committing crimes outweigh any theoretical moral benefit of letting them do it. Agreed. Similarly, the idea of taxing your society trillions of dollars to pay one of many competitive groups, that's almost certainly itself a bad and foolish idea. Like, these are things that most ordinary people sort of instinctively realize. Anyway, I'm sorry, go on.
No, I'm just going to say, well, I mean, let's get into the specifics here, though. I mean, I can't believe you endorse every aspect of the Giuliani approach to crime. I mean, and the Rockefeller and the Joe Biden. So the crime bill. So let's talk about this. I mean, the mandatory minimums is the center of the crime bill of 1994, infamous Joe Biden crime bill. Very long sentences required for various offenses, including drug dealing and especially drug dealing. Now, what do you think about those? I mean, 10, 20, 30, 40 years for drug dealing. What would you that are, and that taking discretion from judges too. What would you think about that?
My honest opinion. So there are a couple things. First of all, like in my ideal world, drugs wouldn't be illegal. So we would focus on the criminals. I'm going to say that one sentence again and then kind of get into the core of this. So in my ideal world, there would be virtually no drug laws. There would be very few laws against consensual crimes like prostitution in general. So this would never have become an issue that's at all morally questionable or concerning. So with the other stuff like killing rapists and gangbangers, or at least locking them up for long periods of time, I think you'd find, at least in private, 95% society-wide agreement on this. I think there were a lot of quiet Giuliani voters in New York during this period who were tired of drunks and bums and muggers on the goddamn train. In fact, I know they were, as a political scientist. There are several famous books about this. But the drug thing does complicate it a little bit. That said, I think that one of the most influential and mistaken books I've read is The New Jim Crow. Many people believe that a very large percentage of the people in jail are there simply for possession of drugs. And that's not accurate. Right. I mean, like I actually, for another project I'm working on, I have the state and federal prisons data in front of me. And it looks like, actually it's right here at the bottom of the screen, it looks like about 9.8% of the people in state facilities are there for drugs, period. That's possession and dealing. Right. And I mean, when you look at those cases, like the huge majority of those are going to be what's called drop downs or plea downs. Like you're a vice lord, you're quote unquote hustling OT, you go from St. Louis to Chicago, you have an AK-47 and 3 keys in the trunk, you're caught, you plead to the 3 keys. You've also probably killed 8 or 9 people in your life if you're a shooter for the vice lord and you're at the level where you're allowed to move out of town. And you get 20 years. I mean, I don't think that's entirely unreasonable. But so that's 10% of the prison population, and that's mostly hardcore criminals that are at that trap star, 5-star level in street terms. So that really is my take on it. As we legalize drugs, I would be very lenient on parole for those boys. Okay. But that's about it. I mean, they broke the law. It's not necessarily the most serious law, but it's also not the majority of the people we have in jail. I mean, so that's the thing. I mean, like the most common crime, and I'm going to shut up after this one, but the most common crime for both white and black men, it's like number 2 for Hispanic men, that people are incarcerated for is murder. Because it's the crime that carries the longest sentence with it. It's something that both the mostly Caucasian biker gangs, racist groups, and the black gangs are known for. You got a lot of shooters in there, mobsters as well. So, I mean, this idea that if we legalize drugs and we were relaxed on parole for a couple of years, we'd clean out the prisons, half the people in prison would leave. No, we'd reduce the prison population by about 3%. And I'd be fine doing that. Love to do that. It's when you get below that, when you get beyond 10%, let's say, because there's some nonviolent guys we could let go. But I mean, you're letting out pedophiles, murderers. It's like you said, and I thought this was a great summary. Only an idiot could deny that locking up criminals would reduce crime. So you have to weigh the issues of the violent criminal, the rapist, for example, against the interests of the citizen. Sure. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Let's go back to the paper. The genesis of the paper was you guys noticing that almost all the scholarship on Black Lives Matter was about the activism itself. How did Black Lives Matter organize this rally and this coalition and, demand this thing and that thing, instead of seeking ways to police better and save more Black lives? And that's why you guys wrote this article. How strange. Yeah. So, I'm going to go with this. Let's talk about the cities that were the big losers in this that came out last. So Las Vegas and Albuquerque, I think, were at the bottom, and Baltimore. Baltimore's the one, right? So let's talk about those places. And why are they so bad? Why are you so much more likely to get killed by the police in those cities? Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different factors. I mean, I noticed that some of them were in fact, a lot of the bottom 10 were heavily Latino cities. This is just me theorizing. But again, in the case of Latinos and poor whites, I mean, you had groups that had high crime rates, but no lobbyists. So, I mean, I think that there are going to be a lot of violent encounters with police officers that no one's going to care about. So I think if you don't have those policies in place, like you have the 20-page document every time a firearm is drawn or used, I mean, you might get some shootings. And again, I mean, if you look through social media following a shooting of a well-known Hispanic or working poor Caucasian, Italian American for that matter, although it's less common, gang member or shooter, I mean, it's mostly complimentary, like cops just doing their job, cleaning up the trash. But when you see something, and I don't necessarily approve of that, but when you see something similar in Black communities, this itself would be interesting as the subject for a paper. It'll be mostly qualitative, but there is a great deal of why are they murdering our babies and so on down the line. So I think that just that factor of majority non-Black but poor might be relative, might be important. But then again, Baltimore is a majority Black city. So, I mean, I think the key factor is that the cities that did the worst were regional rather than national. I mean, of those three, I don't think there's an NBA basketball team in the group, which might sound kind of stupid, but that's a standard proxy for literally major league. You know, I mean, it's Baltimore. Albuquerque, I don't think has a major league sporting franchise or the equivalent in terms of opera or the arts. I mean, it's a great city if you've been to Kirky, but it's just those are kind of AAA good sized towns. They're dealing with big city crime. They're dealing with people really moving weight, but that don't have necessarily the resources to respond to that, don't have the training. The one thing, if you talk to cops, which I did as part of this paper, as part of the upcoming book with Maury Richards, the cops, so on, the one thing they actually want is more training. Not like more training they have to pay for. So like, we want you guys to roll, so you need to sign up for a dojo and pay $5,000 a year. But if the department's going to cover it and it's something that could be useful, you know, pursuit driving so you can avoid more risky chases, hand-to-hand combat, anything like that, verbal judo. I mean, cops are very, very eager to do that. So I think of these cities, you're talking about regional cities, you're talking about less training.
Okay.
I frankly am sure that you're talking about like a less politically sensitive population. And that's probably most of it. I mean, again, in Baltimore and Vegas, you also can't help but notice that there's a fair amount of municipal corruption. I mean, Baltimore is one of the most poorly governed cities in the country.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So amazingly, we have talked about criminal justice and policing for almost an hour without really talking about race. How on earth did that happen? That never happens because criminal justice, don't you know, is only about Black people. The policing crisis is only about Black people. But let's talk about Black people now. Let's talk about race. Let's talk about some taboo subjects like Breitbart. Did you know this? That Breitbart used to have as one of its verticals, it was like world politics, US politics, and Black crime was another vertical.
Yeah,
you know about that?
So this kind of pisses me off on the right, but like, so there actually is a coherent response to this. I was talking once about the race and IQ debate, and again, I've written professionally about this. So I actually just pulled up the IQ data, and the current IQ for Black Americans is not 78 or 85 or any of the figures used on the alt-right. It's about 92. I mean, that's from Charles Murray, hardly, you know, the beacon of the left. Whites is a little over 100. But I mean, my comment was just like, so the average of Black IQ is the average IQ for Ireland. Like you can think, you know, a third of this gap is genetic or whatever, but like, so what? Why the focus on this? And the guy's comment actually was, well, I'm not a hard hereditarian either. I think the reason that we focus on it is that right now the Kendi school is so dominant.
Ibram X Kendi, right?
Yeah, Ibram X Kendi, sorry. But like, so the argument is that any gap in performance reflects racism. Right. And something as simple as, no, there's a 7-point IQ gap. That's relevant. It's not all that important, but the income gap's only like 20%. And it was like, okay, fair enough. And I think it's the same thing here, where Black Americans, not even half, but commit about 37% of crime. And there's this constant focus on whites, like the problem with the white male, the problematic white male, white boys and guns, all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, it was actually, I think, the Federalist that did this. But they used to have, their response was, every time there was a major national story about like a white shooting or something, and I don't think it's the best way to approach this, obviously, but they would do like the Black version, like, don't forget about these 12 Black people that were shot. And I think that's the approach. Like, if you're going to call out our criminals, we're going to call out your criminals. My response has always been kind of, well, let's just call out rape or whatever without racializing that. I mean, it sounds almost like a glib one-liner, but it's not especially hard to find a white, Black, Arab, or Hispanic criminal. You know, Asian gets a little tougher, Jewish American. But I mean, it's like, it's not very difficult among the 4 or 5 major ethnic groups. So, I mean, the goal would really be reducing crime. But you see why they did what they did. It's still tacky, you know. But
what are the numbers on interracial crime?
Well, see, that's kind of what I'm talking about, and what motivated probably what they did. I mean, the interracial crime. First of all, interracial crime is a tiny percentage of crime. I mean, like violent interracial crimes involving blacks and whites. That's the breakout category I always use, because we're not talking about like a Hispanic guy, domestic violence against his wife or something. But violent interracial crime involving blacks and whites is 3% of index crime. So like there are 20 million serious crimes a year, mostly violent. 600,000 are violent, white on black or black on white crimes. So that's not what's going to kill you. But in this category, and this is where like the alt point is just totally correct, 70 to 90% of it is black on white, varies by the year. Wow. But it's never below like 70 to 75. So again, the whole focus on like how can Black Americans be so forgiving, so loving, so tolerant of white Americans is a complete reversal of reality. And that's why so many urban white kids are getting so irritated by this. It's like, if you don't want to talk about the 3% at all, that's one thing. I think that's cool with everybody on both sides. But if you're going to focus endlessly on the 3%, like why are you focusing on the 10% of that? There's just no logical justification for that, like qual or quant, if you will. Right.
Well, thank you. I think you got to go, don't you?
Yeah. Sorry, I have to jump off in a minute or two, but
okay. It's all good.
Yeah. Talking.
Yeah, no. And you're very good at it. Yeah. So let's finish with this, the most taboo subject, or one of the most taboo in this. It's so taboo that, is it right? The FBI stopped releasing the statistics publicly. The interracial rape numbers.
Yeah, the interracial rape numbers are, I mean, again, it's the same pattern, 80 to 90% black on white. The thing with that,
yeah.
So I'll do the full thing. The alt fact there that became very prominent is that in many years, you'd have like 500 recorded black on white rapes and 0 recorded white on black rapes. The problem with that doesn't mean there's 0 white on black rapes in the country. The white on black rate is probably about half the black on white rate. The problem with that is that the crime data that we use, the serious crime data, doesn't come from the police, who are great but have some flaws when it comes to reporting. It comes from what's called the BJS report, or Bureau of Justice Statistics report, which is a survey of about 160,000 Americans. So only about 10% of the respondents are black. Only about half of those are female. Only about a tenth of those have ever been raped. And I mean, only about a tenth of those would have had the perpetrator, the attacker, be a white guy. So, I mean, if you have a number under 100 in the social sciences, you generally report it as too small to codify. So generally, like in the black sample, which is a tenth the size of the white sample, you'd have like 60 rapes, whereas in the white sample, you'd have 500. But that recorded the white on black as 0, and the black on white would be recorded as the 500. In reality, I mean, you'd have somewhat comparable figures, although the black on white would be higher. And again, the black on white figure was, I think, 14% of rape. So it's important to realize that blacks are 12% of society. But that is, again, the black figure is higher. And the refusal of anyone to discuss this honestly led to a narrative that still goes on today. So I favor honest discussion of virtually everything.
Good. I do too. And that's why you're on this show as many times as I can get you on. Thank you, Will Reilly. You're amazing. Everyone, get on his Twitter, read his article, follow his books. My goodness, we haven't talked about your books. Taboo, great book. And, so many. So yeah, thanks again for coming on. This is great.
Of course. Much love. Great talking to you. Have a good one.
All right. See you soon. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.